thank you for joining us for the Exporting to Australia Supply Chain and Freight Consideration webinar. Over to you, Marshall.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. I'm Marshall Hughes from Freight Companies Australia, coming to you from Dandenong in Australia. So I'll quickly talk about some of the things that Dave's touched upon and just give you a little bit of background in freight in Australia. Next slide, please. So really some basics around definitions, and I think what you'll see, there's some commonality between terms we use in Australia and terms you use in New Zealand, but just to make sure that we're on the same page. A pallet is essentially a piece of wood that is roughly 116 centimetres by 116 centimetres that you can lift on a forklift. In Australia, pallets are dominated by CHEP and LOSCM, so they're either blue or red. And a lot of times when you're talking about moving freight, you're literally talking about pallets. And when we talk about pallet spaces or pallets, you're talking about a space that's roughly 116 by 116, up to 2.4 high. A skid is then anything that can live with a forklift that isn't that 116 by 116. So it might be really long if you're moving piping, or it might be really small if you're moving nuts and bolts and really heavy stuff. Skids can be of any shape or size. So when you're talking skids in Australia, you need to make sure you're giving dimensions and weights. Carton, parcel, box are all interchangeable, and it depends who you are, what your company is, and where you grew up. But essentially anything that's cardboard-ish and can be lifted. There's a lot of things around safety with weights. Again, will be similar to you. So, you know, a bike that's 12 kilos might be fine to lift even up to big box. But again, those nuts and bolts, if it's a 22 kilo carton, you probably just have to watch your safety of the people in the supply chain. And finally, the satchel bag or jiffy bag, something made of plastic or paper, that is your post pack or something like that. So when you're moving stuff around Australia, it's usually one of these four things. Most of the freight here goes in less than a truckload. Some more lingo. Probably the most important thing when you're talking about delivery is DIFOT, which is delivery in full on time. And that's essentially, did the transport company do what they promised? So was it a next day delivery or a 2-day delivery? Did they smash it? And did they get a signature at the other end? It's a key metric when we're tracking transport companies. Cubic, where there seems to be a little bit of difference perhaps between Australia and New Zealand. Basically what we're doing here is it's your ton of feathers versus your ton of bricks. So if I send a ton of bricks, it's quite small. If I send a ton of feathers, it might take up an entire truck. And the transport company needs to get paid to move that truck. So they apply a cubic factor that says this many cubic meters times this factor gives you our charge weight. Typically road freight's 250 kilos or 333 kilos per cubic meter. And air freight might be 167. But companies can really vary on that as well. It's important consideration when you're comparing transport companies, because a good rate at 333, if your freight is cubic, might really be bad for you unless you do the maths. General Express are the two standard levels of service we have here. General basically means it'll get there when it gets there. When we've got capacity, we'll move it. And Express generally means we'll get it there as soon as possible. Notwithstanding Christmas rushes and the Rona at the moment, not a lot of companies are hitting True Express, and those that are making sure their customers pay for it. And finally, just some other 3-letter acronyms that we try to confuse people with: a B2B, which is business to business, which is your normal delivery. Probably what Dave touched on before, which is business a retailer delivers to their store. Then you've got B2C, which is business to consumer, which is your home delivery market. And H2H, human to human. This is where you might require some sort of extra service at delivery. So if it's a refrigerator, for example, there might be a service that says not only does the company deliver it to the home, but they'll actually install it, unpack it, and perhaps take away the old one as well. Next slide, thank you. So just to put in context, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but Australia is really big. This is one of the challenges conceptually that Australian or New Zealand companies have, is that Australia is a lot bigger than New Zealand, which means everything takes a lot longer and is more expensive to move around. The problem, though, is that most of Australia is pretty much empty of people. So 90% of the people live in that Brisbane to Melbourne, Adelaide and Perth area, whereas the distribution of population in the rest of Australia is pretty sparse. This is an important consideration, because if you're a business to consumer market, then your focus is going to be on those big metropolitan centres and a couple of key regional points. But if you're delivering into the really lucrative mining and agriculture area, then you've got to get your stuff into the other 90% of Australia. And there's no one transport company that does all that well. So you need to be choosing the pockets of excellence or picking the eyes out of the different options. So some of the ways we move freight around Australia, again, quite similar to New Zealand. So local courier is essentially your man with a van. So it might be someone delivering point to point. So they'll come and pick it up from my warehouse and take it directly to my customer, or they might do a milk run where they go and do a number of deliveries. There's a lot of point to point. That's the most expensive way of moving things around. You're essentially paying a guy to move things for a period of time. So you're covering their entire costs. Road is the most common way of moving freight in Australia. Again, it's picked up locally, consolidated in a warehouse, for example, in Melbourne, and then shifted interstate. It's a genuine problem at the moment is there's not enough trucks, nor are there enough truck drivers. So we're finding a lot of delays just even moving freight. And you might see freight picked up today in Melbourne, but it might not move until Wednesday night, for example, until a truck comes there. It's okay between the sort of key Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, a little bit of Melbourne, Adelaide, those sort of key routes is going okay. But we're finding that getting freight further afield can be really expensive. There's a suggestion the other day it was costing $10,000 to take a B double of steel from Melbourne to Perth, for example, which is really expensive. The other common option is overnight, which used to be called air freight until someone stuck an altimeter in an air satchel and realised it didn't go above 2,000 feet. This is your most expensive thing, but usually how your small items are done. So we're moving it, it might fly if it's a long haul, but between the major capitals, it's probably going on road as well. Typically really good for e-commerce if you're promising customers really fast delivery and if the key thing of your sales is to get it to them next day. It's a pretty good service even now with the blocks, with a couple of carriers who are struggling though. But yeah, it's different horses for courses. And then rail. So rail in Australia is really underdone, which is disappointing for such a large country with massive distances. Typically, you only use rail to move freight from the east coast to the west coast and vice versa. Perhaps from the south, say Melbourne, into Queensland and northern Queensland, and probably from anywhere into Northern Territory. Again, so really important if you're in the mining ag sector. A lot of road freight, in inverted commas, that goes between the east coast and the west coast actually does travel on rail. So although you might be told it's road, it still might take 7 to 10 days to get there because the train's slow. Key challenge with rail is that the rail between Melbourne and Perth is really unreliable. And in fact, we lost a few days this week or last week to flooding. And once every 2 or 3 months, there'll be a derailment and the line will shut down for 2 or 3 days. It's just something to bear in mind, but really cheap though. Just some of the ways that we try and confuse customers with the way we charge freight in Australia is you might charge a per hour rate. This might be more suited to your local couriers. So you might be paying $35 an hour for a 1 tonne, or you might be paying $92 or $102 for a semi-trailer to move around. One thing to watch there is that the bigger the truck, the longer it takes, but also they might introduce like a back to base rate. So if I'm sending something from Dandenong to Melbourne, which is a 1 hour trip, I might actually get charged 2 hours because they're allowing for the driver to come back. It can be quite expensive. Con and kilo is how most of road and rail freight is calculated, which is basically basic in kilo or consignment in kilo. So I'm sending 20 parcels, I pay 1 basic fee, and then I pay a per kilo charge on top of that. Again, cubic, something to watch there because the rate might be 32 cents per kilo. But if they're big, light and fluffy, for example, if it's apparel or pillows or something that's really nicely packed, you might end up paying for the size and not the weight. Per item is another way we do it. So that might be per pallet, per skid, per carton, per satchel. Sometimes transport companies will conflate per item and a kilo. So you might say it's $10 for the box plus 22 cents per kilo thereafter. So there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing that. Nearly everyone in Australia now is using some sort of technology to dispatch on, so some sort of freight management system to make that happen. But they're convoluted, and I think it's a conspiracy that's actually designed to make it really hard to compare to transport companies. That's just my suspicion. Oh, so not only have we confused you with the way we charge it, but then there's a whole bunch of stuff we didn't tell you about in advance. Fuel surcharge, which is critical at the moment with petrol prices being almost $2 a litre in Australia, sometimes the fuel surcharge component of a consignment can be an additional 20 to 30%. So again, when we're trying to factor in, we're trying to price for our customers, and we're looking at rail might be 32 cents a kilo, which is great. But then at the end of the consignment, we have to add on another 30% for fuel. That can really make things unprofitable if we don't catch it in the first point. Minimum charge is basically a safety net for the transport company. So if I'm on a pallet rate, but I send a carton, they're going to charge me $102 anyway. We get caught out a lot now with residential, remote and redelivery. Essentially, there's some companies that don't want to do residential delivery. And the way they try and dissuade their customers from doing that is they charge anywhere between $5 and $25 for a residential delivery. So if your business is shifting from a B2B model to a B2C model, usually there's a carrier change involved in doing that, because the carrier that was doing the B2B doesn't want the B2C. Remote's another way where we catch you out, because remote is essentially, it's hard to be remote, but 80% of Australia probably falls under that remote surcharge area when you look at the land mass. And another thing that you can't allow for in advance is the extra work, the hand unloading, the waiting. So if a driver that we've engaged to do a delivery to a distribution centre for Aldi gets there and there's a queue or there's a problem and they're stuck there for 3 hours, we're going to be paying the extra 3 hours, which is something that's not possible to know in advance. Okay, so a little bit of a background about the domestic transport companies most of you will heard of. Just a disclaimer, this is not legal advice, and anything I say won't be used against me. Australia Post and Star Trek are the default company that when people launch in Australia, they look to. Australia Post and Star Trek will say they've got the biggest network, the best service. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're absolutely struggling under the massive B2C. There are some agents for Australia Post that are 3 weeks behind on their deliveries. And they're roughly at 140% capacity overall. And what is happening is that when you send something to your customer, you might get lucky and it might get passed through straight away, or it might be held, and the held, that becomes a real problem. And what we get a lot of feedback from customers is that the issue isn't with the sending, it's not with the product, but it's really with the fact that they didn't know where it was after it was sent. The advantage of Australia Post and Star Trek is they can deliver to post office boxes, which no one else can do. So if you're delivering into a regional or remote area, sometimes the only delivery address will be a post office box, which a bit makes them a necessary evil. One of the other larger companies in Australia is Toll Group, which is currently going through interesting times. Was bought by Japan Post 5 or 6 years ago, is now being broken up. There's now a division called Express Global, which also has the previous CEO of Australia Post now running it. Major problems, a good network Australia-wide, but within the divisions, there's a lot of variability in the service and can be really expensive because they're in a mode of trying to make some money. The other large one is TNT, which has been bought globally by FedEx. Service-wise, quite good. Absolutely will not touch anything that is interesting. So they won't do anything that's oversized. They won't do anything that's home deliveries. A really good regional network. And probably at the moment, my preferred carrier for the B2B market. The other two big ones in the e-commerce place are Couriers Please and Aramex. Couriers Please is owned by Singapore Post. Aramex used to be called Fastway, which was a New Zealand company. Thank you. That's actually quite a good company. They're running really well at the moment. When I say everyone's running well, they're overwhelmed, but there seems like they're able to keep up with the deliveries. Really good service for B2C. And when you're comparing them to a Star Trek and Australia Post, Couriers Please and Aramex don't do the whole country themselves. When it gets to regional areas, they actually pass the freight off to Australia Post and Star Trek, which means if you're using Aramex or Couriers Please, you get the advantage of a really good metro delivery, plus the reach into those regional customers as well. And then after that, there's about 15,000 other transport companies. There's everything from one man and a truck through to rail companies and a whole bunch of different careers in between. So some of the challenges in my country, the first is the distance. We talked about that before with the map. It's a really big, to get from Melbourne to Sydney is an 8 to 10 hour drive. To get from Melbourne to Brisbane is a 14 to 16 hour drive. Distance creates a problem because of safety. The key thing that we're looking for and trying to fix in Australia is the safety of our drivers. So there's a lot of regulation now about not letting someone who is tired drive. And if a driver feels fatigued, they are absolutely encouraged to pull over and sleep for anything from 6 to 8 to 10 hours, depending on how tired they are. That can obviously create problems getting freight delivered on time, but it is a key factor. The flip side of the distance challenge is the fact is because we all live in the city, when you get to Melbourne or to Sydney, there's 5 to 6 million people in a really small area. And Sydney in particular is just a nightmare for deliveries. So you might see a scanning that says your freight arrived in Sydney this morning at 6 a.m. The driver's got it on board. That delivery might not even make it that day, because if the driver gets held up, they could be pushed over another day. So setting customer expectations is a real challenge around those deliveries, particularly into metro areas. Talked about safety. Insurance, there is no insurance on most of the freight you'll send in Australia. So unless you absolutely specify and request insurance from the transport company, with a couple of exceptions, they're not going to give it to you. So most of my customers run their own freight insurance. When you do get it from a transport company, it can be prohibitively expensive, and it might be $4 or $5 per $100 of value, which usually makes it not worth doing in the first place. And the final thing is obfuscation. So there's 16,000 postcode suburbs in Australia. So 16,000 unique destinations from a suburb point of view. No two transport companies treat all those suburbs the same. And they can't agree over what is Melbourne or what is Sydney. So when you're trying to set up a new website, for example, and you're trying to do table rates, and you're trying to say, okay, I want to deliver to postcode 2765 in Sydney, each transport company is probably going to treat that as a slightly different destination, which just means you've got to be careful that you're not losing money when you're delivering to those, because you can't assume that Sydney for Australia Post is the same as Sydney for Toll. So some of the pitfalls I see with companies that come into Australia, both new companies launching here or companies coming from overseas. The first is that default I talked about to Australia Post Star Track. It's easy, they'll take, as long as the freight fits within a profile, they don't say no. And it's a really easy thing to set up. A lot of really good marketing makes it a really good choice to start with, but doesn't suit most people who are trying to get those deliveries. Especially if your freight's a little bit interesting, it's going to cause some challenges. The second one is that the too few or too many options. And what I mean by that is no one transport company does all of Australia well, so you can't go with one usually. You usually have to mix and match and use a couple. But then it can become a little bit addictive and you start going down the rabbit hole and end up with a number of different transport companies. One for Victoria, one for Tasmania, two for Sydney, et cetera, et cetera. And that can cause a lot of problems. If you're using a 3PL, it can really bump up your costs. If you're running your own warehouse, it just stresses out your dispatch manager because you might have 5 or 6 vehicles coming in every day. Another trap we fall into in Australia is Christmas starts, goodness knows when, sometime in October. And then we have a lot of nonsense here with, there's a frenzy sale that happens during November. Then we have this Black Friday thing going on as well. Then next year we'll have a bump around Easter where things get really critical. And the challenge also around seasonality is that there's a whole bunch of local public holidays. So there's not a lot, there's a few national ones, but then Victoria and New South Wales have different ones as well. And when you're dispatching and trying to get freight to your customers, knowing when those public holidays are, not knowing when they are, can cause some problems as well. And the final thing to talk about is overspending based on perceptions. So it's quite easy to go with the brand names. We used to say no one gets sacked for putting in Microsoft. So going with a brand name like a Big Toll or a TNT or Australia Post might look good because we've gone with a brand name and a safe thing. Invariably, customers who do that end up paying too much for their freight because they haven't looked at their own unique distribution challenge and built something that's bespoke for them. So I'm not going to pot anyone individually, just a couple of things I've seen in working with some NZTE customers. The first is the chilled and the frozen supply chain is really challenging in Australia at the moment. And right now we're basically full to the brim and there's not a lot of capacity. The chilled and frozen 3PLs and even 2PLs have become really picky in what they do. They love pallet picks, they love pallet storage, not so much with the moving of smaller items. There was a customer who had some opportunities, got excited and moved a couple of pallets of stock into Brisbane, where they're in chiller. But then that product can only travel ambient for 1 to 2 days, which means their sort of reach from Brisbane is pretty much just to Sydney and Melbourne and nowhere else, which means they're missing out on half the country. So a quick phone call to someone like Dave or to me just to say, listen, I'm planning on doing this. What's a better way of doing it? We would have said, listen, whack it in Melbourne, probably just closer to your market and a better place to start, and maybe then help them do something. And just around ambient, sometimes where you choose to partner from a warehouse point of view can be really critical. And if you go, for example, to regional New South Wales, but your market is mostly in the capital cities, even getting freight from regional New South Wales to Sydney can be a 2-day process. And that, when you're trying to be competitive and trying to launch, can just put you out of the game. So if a customer's online, for example, and I call up and they're placing an order and they're looking for a delivery that's really quick, and your best case scenario is 3 days into Melbourne, that might lose you the sale, or it might mean that you have to air freight it, overnight freight it, which will be really expensive and maybe not that much quicker. So just these things, it's a quick phone call or a quick email to someone just saying, listen, we're thinking of doing this, can really help you save a bucket load of money or land more customers down the track.